jump in because I've really got way more stuff that I can probably cover tonight, so we may go another week with Daniel too. So, but that's okay. I got tonight and one more Wednesday. So we'll go ahead and start off with prayer. All right, let's pray together.
Almighty God and Father in heaven, we just want to thank you for you here this evening. And Lord, thank you so very much for this beautiful day, for the beautiful weather that you are enjoying right now. And Father, as beautiful as the weather is, we just would like to ask for a little bit of moisture here. We're getting pretty dry on skin, and Father, we pray that you bless us as you see fit. And Father, Lord, we just thank you for bringing everybody here safely tonight, and we pray that when we part ways here in a little while, that everybody has a safe trip on their journey home. Father, we're so thankful for John and his ability to lead us in this lesson tonight. And Lord, we know he has prepared well, and we're so thankful for his ability to bring that lesson to us. We're grateful for your son, Jesus. We thank you so very much for seeing him die on the cross for our sins. And Father, we just pray that you forgive us for our sins and you can help us, Father, to walk closer to you each and every day. Father, we just pray all these blessings in Christ's name. Amen.
So, we've been going through Daniel mainly. This wasn't a class about Daniel, it was a class about science and history and archaeology that supports things in the Bible. But since Daniel is one of those really contested books of the Bible as to whether or not it's factual, I started looking into it, and it's almost verse by verse by verse through the entire book. There are historical events that line up and coincide with the events. So it ended up being a lot about Daniel, the last couple of weeks. And so we started out looking at, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and Daniel interpreted it, and it was the statue. The head represented Babylon, the chest Persia, the waist Greece, the legs Rome. And then the clay mixed in meant it was going to be weak and would become a divided kingdom. So we get a little bit of information about the future. And then Daniel has a dream, but instead of a statue, it's the different beasts that represent the same kind of thing. But we start getting a little bit more information because now they start naming names and say, this represents the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greeks. So, I've said it before, but one of the biggest reasons that skeptics do not think that Daniel was written when it was written around 550 BC is because the prophecies, especially when we look at chapter 11, are so incredibly detailed that the skeptics say nobody could have known the future to that detail, so it had to have been written after those events happened. That is the only real reasoning they have for saying that Daniel was probably written in 160 BC. But all the rest of the evidence indicates that it had to have been written by Daniel when he served in the Babylonian court and the Persian court, and it was written around 550 BC. So we had just finished looking at chapter 7 or chapter 8? I think it was chapter... We just finished looking at Daniel's vision, and now we're going to look at a little bit more of his vision. And it starts talking about, in chapter 8, which is 2 years later, he says, in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. So he had the vision about the beast. 2 years later, he has this new vision. And this vision that he's having now is probably about 11 years before the fall of Babylon. And in verse 2, Daniel says, he saw himself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. So, up here, we have Babylon, where Daniel is. Here's the city of Susa in the province of Elam. And this was a fortified city that served as a winter capital for the Persian Empire. So Daniel sees himself, he's a Babylonian. This is 11 years before the fall. And the interesting thing about it being 11 years before the fall of Babylon, Cyrus the Great is only just now establishing the Persian Empire by defeating the Medes. So 11 years before the fall, the Persian Empire is just now getting started. Nobody knows who the Persians really are. And Daniel sees himself in the winter capital of the Persian Empire in this vision. It says that he sees a ram. So we have the ram over here. We'll talk about the goat in a minute. But he sees a ram with two long horns. But one horn is longer than the other one. And he says that that longer one grew up later. So we have two horns. Both of them are really long, but the younger horn that grew later is even longer. And those two horns represent, one represents the Mede Empire, and one represents the Persian Empire. So, this vision he's having, there really isn't a Persian Empire yet. It's actually just happening at this exact same time. And the 5th century BC Greek historian Herodotus wrote about the rise of the Median Empire. And he said for a number of years the Medes had ruled the Persians, but Cyrus the Great revolted, and he led the Persian army against the Medes and established the Persian Empire. And that's happening right when he's having this vision. And for a number of years, previously the Medes had ruled over the Persians and treated the Persians as second-class citizens. They got tired of it. Cyrus the Great led a revolt, and he defeated the Medes out of the Mede kingdom and established the Persian Empire, and now they're the ruling class. So the Medes were first, and they were powerful, but the Persian Empire becomes even stronger and grows later, so it's the longer horn that grew up later. And the dream is occurring around 550 BC. And it's right around 550 BC that Cyrus the Great leads his revolt against the Medes and establishes the Persian Empire. So, in verse 4, he says, I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north. So, here's the Persians and the Medes. What is west and north? The Babylonian Empire, where Daniel is. So in the vision, he sees the ram that represents the Medo-Persian Empire charging west and north. And it says in verse 4, it continues, no animal could stand against it and could not and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and it became great. So at the time that the Persians ended up conquering Babylon, the Persian Empire was the largest, most powerful kingdom and empire in the known world at that time. And nobody could stand against them. Nobody could stop them. Nobody could prevent them doing what they wanted. And here's Daniel seeing this 11 years before it happens, really before a Persian Empire even really exists. So this empire is expanding. Nobody can stop it. And it's moving north and west, which is towards Babylon. In verse 5, Daniel says, as I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. So this goat, this one-horned goat, is coming fast, moving rapidly. In verse 6, it says, it came towards the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at it with great rage. Verse 7, I saw it attack the ram ferociously, striking the ram and shattering the two horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground, trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. So, later verses in Daniel chapter 8 confirm these interpretations, because in verse 15 he says, while I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. I heard the man's voice from Eli calling, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. So Gabriel tells Daniel in verse 20, the two-horned ram you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. So Unlike the first vision, where we just get the head represents Babylon, the chest represents another kingdom, the waist represents another kingdom, now we're starting to get names in. And Gabriel tells Daniel the two-horned ram is the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece. Now, at 550, when this is being written, there is no king of Greece. Greece is nothing but a bunch of city-states that are fighting amongst themselves and trying to establish power, but they're not united in any way. So Alexander the Great, in about 320 BC, 325, 330 BC, actually unified the Greek kingdom under one king, and he rapidly swept across the known world and conquered everybody. You know, we talked with Nebuchadnezzar that when he did the siege of Tyre, it took him 11 years to break into that city and conquer Tyre. Alexander the Great conquered the known world in 4 years. So he was an incredibly well-established general, leader of his people, and he swept across the known world in 4 years and conquered everybody. He destroyed the Mede and Persian Empire. When he was done with them, they didn't exist anymore. So, we say now in the vision, we're actually starting to have names of empire. This would be similar to somebody in the 1500s writing about us and our future and our Civil War, our World War I, World War II. How likely would we believe that somebody wrote that and got that much detail correct? Because that's what happened with Daniel. You know, he wrote it and there was so much detail. When we look at chapter 11, there's 45 verses, and every single verse has a historical event that coincides with each individual verse. So we're going to look at Daniel chapter 11, verse by verse, and the historical events that coincide with it. So at the time when Daniel is writing this, there is no king of Greece. You know, the Greeks didn't really come about until about 200, 300 years later. In verse 8, it says, the goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of earth, or the 4 winds of heaven. And then in verse 22, it says, the 4 horns that replaced the one was the broken off representative that represents 4 kingdoms that will emerge from this nation, but will not have the same power. So after Alexander the Great conquered the known world, he died. He was 32 years old. He was a heavy drinker. They think he may have drunk himself to death, or he was possibly poisoned. So after he conquers the known world, he's great power, and suddenly he's broke off. He died. He has no heirs. And that will come into play later in chapter 11. He has no heirs. A son was born to his wife after he died, but he had already put 4 generals in charge of different parts of the kingdom. So when he died, those 4 generals took control of their parts, and we now have 4 kingdoms that are weaker and smaller than the original Greek kingdom that Alexander the Great led. Chapter 9 says, out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. Now, what would the beautiful land be to Daniel? Yeah, Israel. You know, that's the promised land. To him, that's the beautiful land. So this other horn that's going to come out is going to move to the south and east toward the beautiful land. And in verse 10 it says, it grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry hosts down to the earth and trampled on them. Verse 11, it set itself up to be great, to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did. The truth was thrown to the ground. So, out of the 4 kingdoms, the 4 formerly Greek kingdoms, came another ruler. One of the divided kingdoms of Alexander the Great was the Seleucid Empire, which was north of the Bible land. And one of the rulers was Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV. He was not good to the Jews. Antiochus IV reigned from 175 to 164 BC, and he seriously persecuted the Jews. And it says in there that in verse 11, this particular ruler set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. He's basically saying, look, I'm a god. This is one of the coins Antiochus IV minted, and what some of this stuff says over here is he refers to himself as a god. So we have historical evidence that supports that out of one of these four kingdoms comes a ruler who becomes pretty powerful, and he considers himself equal to God, considers himself a deity, and these coins that he minted were found that have his inscription that basically say, I, Antiochus, the God. So Gabriel says about the small horn in this new ruler in verse 23, in the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. So he's going to destroy some of the Jews. In verse 25, he will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. Antiochus' empire was characterized by tyranny, deceit, and brutality. That's how the historians record him. He was brutal, he was underhanded, he was sneaky, he was deceptive. He even plundered against his own allies. So, a deeper look at Antiochus Epiphanes IV, verse 11, back up a little bit, it says, tells us that he set himself to be as great as the commander of the Lord. Gabriel says in verse 25 that he will consider himself superior. And these archaeological coins that they found establish that. They tell us that that's what he thought of himself. He considered himself God manifest. He considered himself deity. 9, like I said, it tells us that he will grow in power towards the beautiful land. And 11 tells us that the little horn took away his daily sacrifice. The Jews had a daily sacrifice in the temple. And when we get into verse 11, we'll look at more detail. But Antiochus made practicing Jewish religion a death penalty. If you practice Jewish religion, you were put to death. So he took away the daily sacrifice. He defiled the temple because he built an altar of Zeus in the Jewish temple and sacrificed pigs on the altar. So this is the kind of guy that Antiochus IV was. He was not kind to the Jews. He did not like the Jews. And he did everything he could to get them to become Greek and not be Jews. So, we don't have the Maccabean books in our Bible, but the Maccabean stories still have some credibility to them. And the Maccabean writers tell us that after Antiochus waged war against Ptolemy, on his way back to Egypt, he plundered the temple of Jerusalem, and 2 years later he sent one of his generals to destroy many towns in Judah, and he killed a lot of Jews. Some of the stuff I read said that he slaughtered over 40,000 Jews and sold another 40,000 of them into slavery. And as we go through these prophecies, we don't have a lot of detail in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. We get more detail in Daniel's vision, but when we get into chapter 11, we get some very good extreme detail on what Antiochus IV did to the Jews and what the Ptolemaic kingdoms and the Seleucid kings did to each other. And it's really pretty interesting how it all fits together with history. So at the end of verse 25, Gabriel tells Daniel that he will be destroyed. Antiochus IV will be destroyed, but not by human power. Antiochus Epiphanes IV did not die in battle. He was not assassinated by rivals. He did not die at the hand of another human. Various historical records indicate that he died from illness. And Josephus, a Jewish historian who wrote in the 1st century A.D., Polybus, a Greek historian from 2nd century B.C., Apian, a Roman historian who wrote in 2nd century A.D., and Diodorus Siculus, a Roman historian who wrote in the 1st century B.C., all record that Antiochus IV died of illness. So, the Bible said that this ruler would be killed, but not by human hands. And he did not die by human hands. Now, after chapter 8, for some people, depending on what you read, things begin to get just a little bit more complicated on interpretation. So, some of the things in chapter 9 don't have a lot of historical documentation to support it. But there are some things that might be a little bit more open to interpretation. I've said before, just because we don't have evidence doesn't mean we're not going to eventually find evidence. And it doesn't mean that these things didn't happen. We just haven't found the evidence, or we have not translated the tablets yet. I mentioned there are thousands of untranslated Aramaic tablets that were found in Qumran and other areas because we just don't have that many people that can read cuneiform or speak ancient Aramaic. So these tablets, they just typically don't get translated until somebody has a need to translate a specific one out. So Daniel chapter 9 starts out with the name of another ruler of Babylon. It says, in the first year of Darius, here's where we are. In the first year of Darius, son of Xerxes. Now this is probably the Darius the Mede that we already talked about. After the fall of Babylon, Darius the Mede. And there are rulers named Xerxes. There is a Xerxes that has a son named Darius, but it happened much later in history. But the name Xerxes has been around for a while. It's not a new name. And Xerxes means, this Darius, son of Xerxes, was a Mede. So Darius the Mede that we talked about in earlier chapters still fits within that description. And the name Darius the Mede at the end of Daniel chapter 5 and the beginning of Daniel chapter 6 is probably the same Darius the Mede that we're seeing here. And besides being called Darius the Mede, he was sometimes called Darius, son of Ahasuerus. And Ahasuerus is sometimes translated as Xerxes. So, Xerxes means ruler over heroes. And when Xerxes the first was made king, that's when the name really became popular. But the name Xerxes had been around before Xerxes the first had ever taken the throne. And I'm sure that after taking the Babylonian kingdom without losing any soldiers and not having to use any force because they basically snuck in at night, killed Belshazzar and took the kingdom, he was probably considered a hero and probably considered all of his people to be heroes. So his army, was fit if they would call him Darius, son of Xerxes, because he was ruling over a bunch of heroes. Now, Daniel chapter 9 is taking place around 539 BC. Daniel at this time is probably around 80 years old, maybe a little bit more. And this is about 66 years into the Jewish captivity. So Daniel was likely born around 620 and likely brought to Babylon as a captive when he was 15 years old in 605. And he's been there 66 years. So he's right about 80, 81 years old. And Jeremiah had foretold that the Jews would be in captivity in Babylon for 70 years. And we see in Daniel chapter 9, verse 2, he says, I, Daniel, understood from scriptures, according to the word of the Lord given to Jeremiah the prophet, that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. So Daniel's been there 66 years. He knows the prophets, he knows the scriptures, he knows that Jeremiah said it would last 70. He knows he's been there 66 years. He knows it's getting ready to end. So, in verse 3 through 19, Daniel's praying about it. He's confessing the sins of the people, asking for forgiveness, hoping that God will be lenient to them, and that this 70 years will be over. Now, have you ever wondered why they were in captivity for 70 years? Why not 50 years? Why not 60? Why not 100? 100's a nice even number. Why did God choose 70 years? Does it mean anything for him to choose 70 years? So
they had stopped doing some of the things that God instructed. On this year you're supposed to do this. On this year you're supposed to do this. They ignored that, and it pretty much added up to a God that doesn't do that.
right. So the stuff I'm going to talk about now is not my idea. It's some stuff I read about, but it made a lot of sense to me. I thought it was really pretty interesting. But Ritter's right. In Leviticus 25, 1 through 7, the law of Moses, it says, the Lord said to Moses at Mount Sinai, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I am going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather the crops. But in the 7th year the land is to have a year of Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vines. Do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the grapes of your unheeded vine. The land is to have a year of rest. Whatever the land yields during the Sabbath will be food for you. For yourself, for your male and female servants, and the hired workers and temporary residents who live among you, as well as for your livestock and the wild animals of the land, whatever the land produces will you eat. So God told Moses to tell the Israelites, every 7th year, you are to let the land rest. And apparently, across the centuries, Israel had ignored that. There was no evidence that they had ever observed this Sabbath year of rest. And in their pre-captivity. So according to the testimony of one biblical writer in 2 Chronicles 36:21, it says, the land enjoyed its Sabbath rest all the time of its desolation it rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. So 70 years of Babylonian captivity was assigned until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. And each one of the 70 years of captivity represented a violation of every 7 years letting the land have its Sabbath rest. And if that's true, the way Chronicles 36:21 seems to suggest, this would indicate that Israel had violated this year of Sabbath rest for 490 years. Keep that number 490 in your mind as we look at the rest of the chapter. In verse 21, Gabriel, who's explaining these visions to Daniel, he is about to explain. A lot of people ask this, in Daniel chapter 9, what is the 77s? And the general thought about the 77s means that, to the best of my study, like I said, this is not my idea, this is some stuff I read. What is 77s? What is 7 times 7? 490. So we look at the captivity and see 490 years of Israel not obeying the Sabbath year's rest for the land, so they get punished with 70 years of captivity. Now Gabriel is getting ready to tell about another 490-year time period. In verse 25, he says, know and understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 70 490-year period would be the death of the anointed one. In verse 26, after the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come to destroy the city and the sanctuary, the end will come like a flood, war will continue until the end, and desolation has been decreed. In verse 27, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. So we have 7 sevens and 62 sevens. That gets us to 69 sevens. And then in verse 27, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifices and offerings. And at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. So in the middle of the last 7 is when the anointed one will die. In 457 BC, so we have that right here. In 457 BC, Ezra took people from Babylon back to Jerusalem. We can read about this in Ezra chapter 7, verse 6 and 7. Verse 6 says, "This Ezra came up from Babylon. He was a scribe, well versed in the law of Moses, given by the Lord, the God of Israel. The king granted him all that he requested because the hand of the Lord, his God, was over him." Verse 7, "Some of the Israelites and some priests, Levites, singers, gatekeepers, and temple servants also came up to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes." Artaxerxes reigned from 465 to 424 BC. The 7th year of Artaxerxes would be 457. So in 457 is when Ezra and his group first head out. Now, did Ezra rebuild the wall in Jerusalem? No. But if you look further down at some other verses, Ezra 9:9, "For slaves we are, but in our slavery our God has not abandoned us. Rather, he has turned the good will of the kings of Persia toward us. Thus he has given us new life to raise again the house of our God and restore its ruin, and has granted us the protective wall in Judah and Jerusalem." So Ezra is sent out with a group of people. He has the blessing of the kings of Persia, and he did not succeed in building the wall. Nehemiah came later and did that, but he had the blessings of the king to go and rebuild. So that's the word of the Lord going out. And from 457 to 408, that's how long it took them to rebuild. When Nehemiah shows up later, they completed it in 408. That's 49 years. That's the first 7 sevens. 62 sevens is 434 years from 408 BC to 26 AD. What happened in 26 AD? We're all here every Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night because of it. Jesus began his ministry. He was baptized by John the Baptist in 26 AD and began his ministry. So, 62 sevens. In the middle of 1 7, what's half of 7? 3.5. Jesus' ministry lasted for about 3.5 years, and he was put to death in 30 AD. So, we have our 7 sevens. So we go back 490 years, and the Israelites are not upholding the commandments of the Sabbath rest for the land. They go into captivity for 70 years. When it's over, we have another 490 years all the way up to the death of Jesus, which is the anointed one. So it fits history very well. It fits what we know very well. The time frames, the dates, the historical events, who was king, who wasn't king, it all fits with what Daniel was seeing in this vision that was written back in 550 BC. So, nearly 600 years earlier, Daniel is seeing this and writing it down. So I jumped ahead. I gotta find where I was in my notes. So that kind of gets through chapter 9. I know I'm going through this stuff stuff really, really fast because we actually probably could have done about a 16-week study just on Daniel alone, and I'm trying to get through all of Daniel in like 3 weeks. So we're moving through it pretty quick. So Daniel chapter 10, Daniel is having another vision. About 4 years before the fall of Babylon. So the vision we just looked at with the ram and the goat was about 11 years before the fall of Babylon. Now we're about 4 years before the fall of Babylon. It says in the 3rd year of Cyrus, Babylon fell in 359. Darius the Mede ruled for about 10 months. And then Cyrus the Great took over. So in the 3rd year of Cyrus's rule, we're at about 535 BC. You know, one thing that I read said that this particular vision was probably just a few weeks before Daniel's death. You know, Daniel's getting probably pretty close to about 85 years old. So he, you know, especially at any time, especially at this time, he's getting to be quite elderly. You know, he's been through a lot. Yes, he's had a really good life serving in the royal court, but he still has a lot of anguish over not being in the beautiful land and he's still a captive. He may be in a gilded cage, but he's still captive. So, chapter 10 is an introduction to what's going to be revealed in the vision in chapter 11. Chapter 10, 11, and 12 are all the same vision. They all go together. You know, we get reminded all the time, Daniel didn't write chapter breaks. He just wrote. Somebody else came in and put chapter breaks. So, really, 10, 11, and 12 all go together. And you know, in chapter 11, God is about to reveal to Daniel some pretty amazing and pretty detailed, specific things about major world events. He's going to begin with the Medo-Persian Empire that had just recently conquered Babylon. And this history is really going to go through probably to about 70, maybe a little bit later than 70 AD. So, with Daniel chapter 10, verse 14 says, "Now I have come to explain to your people," who are Daniel's people? The Jews. And he's saying, "I have come to explain to your people in the future, for the vision concerns a time yet to come." So he's saying, I'm going to tell you something that's going to happen with your people, the Jewish people, and it's going to be coming in the future. So this vision that starts in chapter 10 and ends in chapter 12 is about the Jewish people. When we get into chapter 11, the vision begins to get very detailed about specific future events. So, I debated on how to do this. I wanted to put the Bible verse here and the historical events on the other side, but I knew that some of them would be so tiny you wouldn't be able to read it. So since everyone should have their Bible or their Bible on their phone, some of the times I have the Bible verses and some of the times I have the historical events. And you may not be able to read the Bible verses because they make it pretty tiny, but they'll be there. So in chapter 2, or in chapter 11, verse 2, it says, "Now I shall tell you the truth. 3 kings of Persia are yet to appear, and a 4th shall acquire the greatest riches of all. Strengthened by his riches, he shall stir up all kingdoms, even that of Greece." Remember, Greece is not a kingdom yet. But Gabriel is telling Daniel, there's going to be this ruler coming, and he's going to be pretty powerful, and he's even going to stir up a kingdom that doesn't exist yet. So Cyrus the Great established the Persian Empire, and he is currently ruling Babylon. And how many do we have? 1, 2, 3 more. Xerxes the First is known for his invasion of Greece. If you are familiar with the movie 300, the Battle of Thermopylae, Xerxes the First was king when the Persian Empire was invading and the Spartans were trying to stop them. By the way, it was way more than 300. It was more like 3,000. But there were 300 Spartans, but there were Thanes and Thebans and other Greek soldiers as well. But the Spartans stayed, about 2,000 of them stayed and fought the last man. But the Spartans basically said, we're going to some of them decided to stay with the Spartans and fight with them. So, here we have a very specific verse of prophecy saying, we're at the very start of the Persian Empire. And we have a prophecy saying there are going to be 3 more kings, and one of them is going to be really powerful, the 4th one, which he's number 4, and he's going to stir up the kingdoms. And Xerxes was also, he was a wealthy, powerful ruler. He was also known for really great expansive building projects as well. So by this time, Xerxes I, the Persian Empire is pretty powerful. Probably the most powerful in the known world at this time. When Xerxes, he's somewhere here in the mid-400s that he's invading Greece. And again, Greece is not unified. It's still a bunch of city-states, which is why you have the Spartans deciding they're going to fight, and maybe some of the others deciding, and some of them sent slaves to fight in their place. We don't have a king of Greece who's getting his whole Grecian army up and we're all going to defend against the Persians, because we're not at that point yet. That doesn't happen until about 336. In verses 3 and 4, but a powerful king shall appear and rule with great might, doing as he wills. No sooner shall he appear than his kingdom shall be broken and divided in 4 directions under heaven, but not among his descendants or in keeping with his mighty rule, for his kingdom shall be torn to pieces and belong to others. So, we talked about that once Greece is unified under Alexander the Great, he is powerful. 4 years he conquers the known world, but as soon as he appears, no sooner shall he appear, he dies. Poisoning, murder, whatever, drank himself to death, disease, we don't really know for sure. And his kingdom is divided into 4 directions under heaven. So this is around 336 when he conquers Babylon, the Medo-Persian Empire, more than 200 years after the prophecy is written, and around 323 when he dies and his kingdom is divided. The 4 kingdoms that are formed are Macedonia, which is basically Greece, and that's under the rule of Antipater and his son. Thrace, which is part of Asia Minor under Lysimachus. The Seleucid kingdom, which is under Seleucus Nicator. They'll be known as the Seleucids. And then Egypt and Palestine, which is under the rule of Ptolemy. And they will be the Ptolemies, the kingdom of the Ptolemies. So basically it looks kind of like this. We have the Seleucid Empire, the Ptolemy Empire, and then the other 2 are up here. We're not really concerned with them because the prophecy doesn't really talk about them. But what is between the Ptolemy and the Seleucid empires? Right about here is the Promised Land, the Bible lands. So when you read chapter 11, you see a lot of stuff that says the king of the north, the king of the south. King of the north, the Seleucid Empire is to the north. The Ptolemy Empire to the south. So this is what they're talking about, the kings of the north and the kings of the south. The Promised Land, the Bible land, is caught in the middle of the power struggle between these 2. They're constantly trying to conquer and acquire each other's lands. In verse 5, the king of the south, this would be the Ptolemies, shall grow strong. But one of his princes shall grow stronger still and govern a domain greater than his. Ptolemy I, he really wanted Palestine and Asia. He wanted to take it from the Seleucid Empire. And he was pretty powerful. And then he had Ptolemy II. He was not that powerful. He just kind of maintained. But his grandson, Ptolemy III, he was considered one of the powerful rulers of the Ptolemy Empire. He expanded his territory greatly. So here we have the king of the south, the Ptolemies, grow strong, but one of his princes even stronger and governs a larger domain. And this is all written down 400 years before it happens. In verse 6, after some years, they shall become allies. So after some years, the king of the north and the king of the south are going to become allies. And it says in Daniel, the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to carry out the alliance. Ptolemy II's daughter, Bernice, was sent to marry the king of the north, Antiochus II. That's a known historical event. And then it says, but she shall not retain power, and his offspring shall not survive. 5 years after, so in order for this to happen, Antiochus II has to divorce his wife Laodice. She does not like that. So 5 years after this marriage, Bernice has a son, and Ptolemy II dies. Antiochus II says, deals off, I'm going back to my first wife, Laodice. Laodice says, well, we can't have her son assuming the throne, so Laodice has Bernice and her son killed. And she shall be given up together with those who brought her. Her whole entourage, her son, they're all murdered by Laodice. And Antiochus goes back to Laodice. Verse 7, the descendant of her line shall succeed to his place. Ptolemy III, Bernice's brother, is pretty upset that Laodice killed his sister. He wants revenge. So he comes against the army and enters the stronghold of the king of the north, Antiochus II's stronghold. He wages war on him from 246 to 241 BC, conquers him, plunders the Seleucid Empire, and carries a ton of plunder back to Egypt. Verse 8, even their gods with their molten images and their precious vessels of silver and gold, he shall carry away as spoils of war into Egypt. For years he shall have nothing to do with the king of the north. Some of the spoils that he took, he recovers idols of Egypt that were taken by Cambyses, who was another ruler of the Persian Empire, or the Babylonian Empire back in 424. So Cambyses had invaded Egypt, taken the idols back to his empire, and now as Ptolemy is revenging his sister Bernice, part of the plunder he ends up with are the images that had been previously carried away, and he takes them back to Egypt. Verse 8. Nope, verse 9. I have 2 pages of verse 8 here. In verse 9 it says, then the latter shall invade the land of the king of the south. So the king of the north is going to invade the land of the king of the south because he wants revenge. And he's going to, and then he returns to his own country. So Antiochus II's son, Seleucus II, he invaded, but he didn't make it all the way into Egypt, but he did regain control of some of the land that Ptolemy III had taken from Antiochus II. So he regained some control of the land that Ptolemy III had conquered earlier. In 10, but his sons shall be aroused and assemble a great armed host, which shall pass through like a flood and again surge around the stronghold. The king of the south, in rage, shall go out and fight against the king of the north, who shall field a great host. But the host shall be given into his hand. When the host is carried off in the pride of his heart, he shall bring down tens of thousands, but he shall not triumph. And now we're talking about Antiochus III, one of his sons, one of Seleucus II's sons, Antiochus III. He launches a large expedition against the Ptolemies, the kingdom of the south, to take Phoenicia and Palestine. This is around 219 BC. But it ends with a serious setback at the Battle of Rapina, which happens in 217 BC, where Antiochus III, who has a larger army, is defeated by Ptolemy IV, who has a much smaller army, which is what it says. The host, where is it? He shall go out and fight against the king of the north, and shall field a great host, but he's going to lose to a smaller army. And during that battle, Antiochus lost 17,000 soldiers. But in 203 BC, Ptolemy IV dies, and his 4-year-old son is his successor. Now, not too many 4-year-olds are good at battle, so Antiochus III sees this as his opportunity to go back after the Ptolemaic Empire, because a 4-year-old's in charge, plus the people that are guiding him. So he reattacks and strikes again. For the king of the north shall raise another army greater than before. After some years he shall attack with a large army and great resources. In those times many shall resist the king of the south, and violent ones among your people. Whose people is he talking about? Daniel's people. Some violent people amongst the Jews shall rise up in fulfillment of vision, but they shall stumble. When the king of the north comes, he shall set up siege works and take the fortified city by storm. The forces of the south shall not withstand him, and not even his picked troops shall have the strength to withstand. The invader shall do as he wills, with no one to withstand him. He shall stop in a glorious land, beautiful land, glorious land, and it shall all be in his power. So, verse 13. Antiochus III invades Palestine and conquers the fortress of Gaza. Verse 14. Some violent Jewish men aid Antiochus III in these battles, which helps Antiochus III win over the Ptolemies. But this is going to lead to their own downfall, the Jewish people's downfall, because by Antiochus III winning, that's going to allow Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, who was so horrible to the Jews and killed thousands of them, now has the ability to rule the promised land as ruler, because the Jewish people helped Antiochus III win. So, looking at verse 15, Antiochus III, king of the north, is able to take the well-fortified city of Sidon. He's able to bring in his siege works. They can't stop him. He takes Sidon. And that victory, when he takes Sidon, looking at verse 16, puts all of Palestine under his control. So again, we have these historical events that we know they've happened. We've looked at the history of these battles, and they're following this prophecy verse for verse in great detail that Daniel is seeing and writing down. Verses 17 through 19. He shall resolve to come with the entire strength of his kingdom. He shall make an alliance with him and give him a daughter in marriage in order to destroy him. But this shall not stand. He shall turn to the coastland and take many prisoners, but a commander shall put an end to his shameful conduct so that he cannot retaliate. He shall turn to the strongholds of his own land, but shall stumble and fall and be found no more. Since Antiochus III conquered Palestine, he had power over the Ptolemies. He beat them, I win, you lost, I'm in charge now. But he was hoping to gain advantage over the Ptolemies who were ruling Egypt at the time, and he forces them into a peace alliance. How does he do that? By giving him a daughter in marriage. So Antiochus III sends his daughter Cleopatra to the Ptolemies to Egypt to form an alliance, and she marries Ptolemy V. And that happens in 195 BC. But Cleopatra, it says here that he shall make an alliance with him to give him a daughter in marriage in order to destroy him, but it doesn't happen. So Antiochus III wants this advantage over Ptolemy V, so he sends his daughter Cleopatra, but Cleopatra sides with her husband, Ptolemy V. So Antiochus III doesn't get any benefit by this forced peace treaty in this marriage, because Cleopatra is like, I don't care, Dad, I'm siding with my husband. So after this defeat, or since he didn't gain any power because of this, Antiochus, then the Romans come in and they tell Antiochus, hey, get out of Egypt. Now the Romans are appearing. We've not seen them yet. We've seen them represented as the iron legs in Nebuchadnezzar's dream and as the terrible ten-horned beast in Daniel's vision, but we haven't seen them come into these political and world events yet until now that Antiochus III, the Romans tell him, get out of Egypt. And Antiochus has to do that. In fact, he fights against the Romans at the coastline, and the coastal ships from the Romans are coming in, and the troops are coming on, and they defeat Antiochus III. And as part of the deal, when they defeat Antiochus III, they make him give over 20 select hostages. And one of them is his son, Antiochus IV, who is also Antiochus Epiphanes. So as a young child, he is sent to Rome to grow up under Roman influence during his influential years. This is one of the reasons that Antiochus is the way he is towards the Jewish people. Because did the Romans like the Jewish people? Not too much. The Romans didn't really like anyone that didn't obey them. So Antiochus IV is now a child sent to Rome where he's going to grow up because of this battle with Antiochus III. Antiochus III is told to get out, and by the way, you're going to surrender your army, your navy, and you're going to pay the Romans 15,000 to 20,000 talents over a period of several years in order to keep us from attacking you. So Antiochus III is then unable to make those payments. It says here that he shall return to the stronghold of his own land, but shall stumble, fall, and be found no more. He can't make the payments. The Seleucid people are really upset with him. He is trying to come up with money, so he's pillaging a temple in Elymais. And the people become so angry with him, the mob kills him. And he is no more. So verse 20, in his stead, one shall arise who will send the collector of tribute through the glorious kingdom, through the Bible lands, or through the whole kingdom. But he shall soon be destroyed, though not in conflict or in battle. After the death of Antiochus III, Antiochus IV has been sent off to Rome. So his eldest son, Seleucus IV, becomes king. He reigned for 12 years, but he has to pay all of this money to tribute to the Roman Empire. And they don't have it. So he heavily taxes the people for years in order to try and come up with all this money so that they can pay the Roman tribute. And the people are so fed up with it, they don't like him. And Seleucus IV's minister, who has been put in charge of this, his name is Helidorus, he ends up deciding to take matters into his own hands, and he poisons Seleucus IV and kills him. So he was destroyed, but not through conflict or in battle. And I heard the second bell. So I think we're going to stop there, and then we'll look at verses 21 through 34. But you can see that, and I realize this is small, but I have to take it all on one page. You can see all of this, that here are known historical events that are coinciding perfectly with the prophecies that Daniel wrote down in 550 BC, and now they're happening they started at about 539 BC, and they've been accurate we're all the way up to about 150 BC now. And these events have been just perfectly preserved in history, and they coincide verse for verse exactly with what Daniel has written down. This is the number one reason that most opponents of Daniel being written in 550 is they simply say there is no way he could have had this kind of detail of future events. But God could have given it to him. You know, if you believe in a God that could have done it, then yes, he easily could have had this kind of detail. But this is the only real reason that most skeptics say that Daniel was written much later in history after these events happened. Because that's the only way they could have gotten the details correct. But all the other evidence indicates that it was written in 550, hundreds of years before these events took place. So next week we're going to finish up with Daniel 11 and 12, and then we have Christmas, New Year's, and then Buck Farmer's going to take over. So, any questions? I know I went really fast. If you want to, there's a really good, so there's a church in Florida called West Palm Beach Church of Christ, and they have some really good sermons on the New Testament and Old Testament books. And I found a lot of this information, then I found that website, and I looked at their Daniel in the Lion's Den. It was done in 2002 or 2006. He has each individual chapter laid out with all the history and verse and what's going on, far more detail than I'm giving right now. But it's a really great website if you want to look and read about it yourself. There's, I think, 12 or 13 sermons on it. So, like I said, I'm trying to cover 12 or 13 sermons in like 4 weeks. If you don't have any questions, that's all I got. I appreciate it, and we'll finish up next week for sure.